All right, welcome to our deep dive into the lead up to the Civil War.
It's a fascinating period.
It is, and it looks like you're trying to understand not just what happened, but the why. Like, what were the tensions that actually tore a country apart?
Right.
And the sources you gave us, we've got like a history podcast episode and then excerpts from another one, kind of meta.
Yeah.
But hey, the more perspectives, the better, right?
Absolutely. And these sources, they really take us right into the thick of it in the 1850s when the whole slavery question was already like a powder keg.
Okay, so 1850s, U.S. deeply divided over slavery.
Yes.
It's not just politics, though. Our sources describe it as like intensely emotional on both sides. Like, can you imagine an atmosphere where something like the caning of Senator Sumner could even happen?
It's hard to believe, right?
Yeah.
I mean, 1856, a congressman, Preston Brooks, nearly beats Senator Sumner to death on the Senate floor.
Right on the Senate floor.
Yeah, he felt Sumner insulted his family and South Carolina during a speech against slavery. And get this, many in the South saw Brooks as a hero.
A hero.
Yeah.
That's wild. Do the sources show us any other examples of this, like this kind of escalating tension and violence?
Oh, yeah. They talk about a lot of rising violence, both in person, and in the media. Like we hear about newspaper editors being threatened, abolitionist speakers being attacked, and even like armed clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers out in Kansas.
Jeez. It's almost like unbelievable how quickly things just escalated.
It's true.
Speaking of Kansas, our sources point to that Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854
Right.
as like a major turning point. Now, it sounds kind of technical at first, something about territories voting on whether to allow slavery, but why was it such a big deal?
Well, it overturned the Missouri Compromise from 1820. That compromise had, it kept a pretty fragile peace for decades by setting boundaries for where slavery could and couldn't expand. But this Kansas-Nebraska Act, it basically said, let the people in these territories decide. But of course, the people didn't include enslaved people.
Oh, I see. So instead of calming things down, it just threw more fuel on the fire.
Exactly. It just
Yeah.
blew up the existing political parties.
Really?
Yeah, Southern Whigs joined the Democrats, and Northern Whigs, they helped to form that new Republican Party, focused on stopping slavery from spreading.
So it forced everyone to take sides.
Yeah, and the stakes were, they couldn't have been higher.
And that's where a familiar name enters the picture, right? Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, yeah.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act basically pulled him back into politics, didn't it?
It did. He saw it as, this moral betrayal and a threat to the future of the nation.
Huh.
Now, it's important to remember that Lincoln wasn't an abolitionist at this point, at least not yet.
Oh, really?
He opposed slavery's expansion, but he didn't yet believe the federal government had the power to just abolish it where it already existed. So he was trying to find a way to contain it, to stop it from spreading.
Interesting. So a more nuanced position than a lot of people might realize.
Yeah.
And this nuanced stance, this is kind of what sets the stage for those famous debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Lincoln-Douglas debates. Those were legendary. It captivated the nation, these two very different men debating the future of slavery.
It's almost like a classic like hero versus villain kind of story, right?
Yeah.
You've got Douglas, the little giant, this like seasoned, powerful politician.
And then you have Lincoln, lanky, self-made lawyer from the frontier. And he's known for that folksy style and kind of like dry wit.
I can picture it. So in these debates, we see Douglas try to find this middle ground on slavery, right? With his Freeport Doctrine. It was basically his attempt to make everyone happy, wasn't it?
Yeah, he argued that settlers in a territory could effectively block slavery, even if the Supreme Court said they couldn't.
Yeah.
He was trying to like thread a needle, trying to find some way to keep the Union together.
But that attempt to compromise, it actually blew up in his face, didn't it?
It did. Southerners felt betrayed, and Northerners, they saw it as just a weak concession to, the slave power.
Hmm.
It's a fascinating example of how even well-intentioned compromise just fails when the underlying issues are just so divisive.
Yeah. And while all this is going on, while Lincoln and Douglas are debating the future of slavery, some people were taking a much more radical path. And our sources, they introduce us to John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859.
John Brown, yeah. He was a radical abolitionist, believed violence was the only way to end slavery. He led a group of men to try to seize the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to start a slave rebellion.
That seems incredibly risky going up against the federal government.
Oh, it was. The raid failed, and Brown was captured and executed for treason. But the impact of what he did was just enormous, especially in the South.
It basically confirmed their worst fears about the North.
Right. I mean, it terrified them. It was proof to them that the North was actively plotting against them. And it fueled the rise of the fire eaters in the South.
The fire eaters. Can you explain who those guys were and why they were becoming so influential?
Sure. So the fire eaters, they were these radical pro-slavery Southerners who believed that secession was the only way to protect what they saw as, their interests.
Okay.
They believed slavery was essential to their economy, their culture, their whole identity.
Mm-hmm.
And they were gaining influence, especially as tensions with the North escalated.
And all this leads us to 1860, one of the most consequential years in American history, and the election that basically changed everything.
Right.
Our sources describe this like crazy four-way race that really fractured the nation, and the Democrats splitting their vote, basically handing the win to Lincoln.
Yeah, the Democratic Convention, it was in Charleston. It was total chaos, delegates storming out, shouting matches.
Yeah.
It was pandemonium. The South Carolina delegation actually walked out. They refused to budge on their demands for federal protection for slavery in all territories.
Wow, it sounds like something out of a movie. So the Democrats, they couldn't agree on a candidate.
Yeah.
And they ended up splitting into two different factions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nominating Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge. And then you throw in the Constitutional Union Party candidate, John Bell, and that basically handed the presidency to Lincoln.
And wasn't Lincoln not even on the ballot in most southern states?
That's right. But the divided opposition meant that he won the Electoral College, even though he got less than 40% of the popular vote.
It's wild. And this was like the final straw for many in the South, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. They saw Lincoln's victory, even without their votes, as a direct threat to their way of life.
Mm.
They felt they had no voice in the government anymore. And secession started to seem like the only option left.
So South Carolina, always the first to make a move, right?
Yep. Yeah.
They declare secession just a month after Lincoln's election. But they weren't alone.
Not at all. By February 1861, 6 more states had seceded, and they formed the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as their president.
And it wasn't just about slavery, right? I mean, their motivation.
It was more complex than that, a combination of things, protecting slavery, yes, but also this fierce commitment to states' rights and a deep fear of the North's growing power and what they saw as the North's hostility towards their way of life.
Yeah, I can see how all of that would lead to this feeling of being trapped, like having no other choice.
Absolutely. And our sources, they really capture that sense of defiance, that kind of like unstoppable tide, with this quote from Jefferson Davis, "Smell Southern powder and feel Southern steel."
You can practically hear the drums of war beating. It seems like everything was just spiraling out of control at this point.
It was. And it all leads to the flashpoint of the war, the event that would finally ignite the powder keg, Fort Sumter. So Fort Sumter, this federal installation right smack in Charleston Harbor, held by a small Union garrison.
And the guy in charge.
Major Robert Anderson.
Okay. So it became like a symbol of the whole conflict, right?
Sure.
A powder keg.
Absolutely. And Lincoln, man, he was in a tough spot. Couldn't abandon the fort, but sending reinforcements, well, that could be seen as a provocation.
And start the war he was desperately trying to avoid.
Exactly. It was a tightrope walk. He ended up sending supplies, but no troops, no weapons, hoping to just kind of keep things cool.
But the Confederates, they didn't see it that way.
Nope. They saw it as an act of aggression, like you're messing with our turf.
A challenge to their sovereignty, something they had to respond to.
Right. And under a lot of pressure, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, he orders the bombardment of Fort Sumter, April 12th, 1861.
The first shots of the Civil War. Crazy. And our sources, they actually give us a glimpse of what it was like inside the fort during this whole attack.
Yeah, we hear from one of Anderson's officers. He talks about feeling isolated, totally outnumbered, and just running out of time as the Confederate shells are raining down on them.
It must have been terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. It's a good reminder that these historical events, they were experienced by real people facing unimaginable fear and uncertainty.
Totally. So the war begins, but even after all that, even after Fort Sumter, not everyone was on board, were they? We still had those 8 slave states that hadn't seceded. What was going on in those border states?
It was a mixed bag, really. A lot of division. Families were torn apart. Communities split right down the middle. You had folks loyal to the Union, others sympathizing with the Confederacy. Lincoln knew he couldn't afford to alienate them.
Because pushing them into the arms of the Confederacy would have been disastrous.
Oh, yeah. Strategically and symbolically, those states were crucial. And we see this play out really dramatically in Baltimore. A mob actually attacked Union troops passing through the city.
Wow. So it wasn't a clean North versus South split. It was brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor.
Absolutely. It tore right through American society. And those divisions within the border states, they would have a huge impact on how the war unfolded. I mean, think about it. Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, Tennessee, they all eventually joined the Confederacy.
Right.
While Kentucky and Missouri, they stayed officially neutral. But, they saw some really bitter fighting between pro-Union and pro-Confederate groups.
It sounds like a real mess.
Oh, it was. And on top of all that, both sides were scrambling to get ready for this war. And a lot of people, probably naively, thought it would be a short one, over in a flash, with a clear winner.
That's kind of interesting. What made them think that?
There was a lot of romanticism surrounding the whole idea of war back then. Grand battles, swift victories. They just weren't prepared for the long, brutal slog it would become.
The horrors of modern warfare.
Exactly.
So both sides had their strengths and weaknesses going into this thing. I mean, the South had experienced military leaders, and they were fighting on home turf.
That's right. Plus, they were really committed to their cause, fighting for their homes, their way of life, their very survival, as they saw it.
But they were also outnumbered.
Oh, yeah. Big time. And outgunned.
Yeah.
The Union, they had the population, the industry, the resources.
I guess the North also had a pretty strong navy, didn't they?
Definitely a major advantage.
Yeah.
That Union blockade of southern ports, that eventually crippled the Confederacy, cut off their trade, and their ability to get crucial supplies.
So in those first days, it really could have gone either way.
Oh, absolutely. Nobody knew for sure. And as it dragged on, it became clear this wasn't just about territory or politics. It was about the very soul of America.
You're right. You're right.
I mean, this war forced Americans to confront their deepest values. What did it really mean to be a nation founded on liberty and equality when you've got millions in chains? Could a nation so divided over such a fundamental issue even survive?
It's a heavy question.
And it's that moral aspect that makes the Civil War so compelling, even today. I mean, it raises these profound questions about justice, freedom, the legacy of the past, stuff we're still wrestling with as a nation. And as the war dragged on and the casualties mounted, slavery just couldn't be ignored any longer.
Because at first, Lincoln was really trying to frame this as saving the Union, right?
Right. Didn't want to alienate the border states or make it about abolishing slavery.
Some delicate balance.
Totally. But as the war went on, that became harder and harder to maintain. I mean, ending slavery, that moral imperative just grew stronger and stronger in the North and even internationally.
And that leads to the Emancipation Proclamation, right, in 1863.
Pivotal moment. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate territory would be, and I quote, forever free.
But it didn't free all the slaves in the U.S., did it? It was only in areas rebelling against the Union.
You got it. It was a wartime measure. Lincoln didn't think he had the power to just abolish slavery outright.
But it was a huge step.
Absolutely. Changed the whole narrative of the war. It was explicitly about ending slavery.
I imagine that had a big impact.
Huge. Boosted support for the Union in the North and overseas. And it demoralized a lot of people in the South.
And it allowed black men to enlist in the Army and Navy, didn't it?
It did. And they did in droves, man, eager to fight for their freedom and the freedom of their families. And they fought with incredible courage. I mean, facing the enemy, but also facing discrimination and prejudice within the Union ranks.
Fighting for a nation that didn't fully recognize their rights.
Exactly. Their contributions to the Union victory were essential. They shattered that myth of black inferiority,
Yeah.
the one used to justify slavery for so long.
So the Emancipation Proclamation, it was more than symbolic. It was a strategic move with huge consequences for the war and for the future of the nation.
100%.
Yeah.
Major turning point, militarily and morally.
And right around that same time, we have Gettysburg.
Oh, yeah. July 1863.
The biggest, most brutal battle ever fought on U.S. soil.
And a turning point. A crushing defeat for the Confederacy. Shattered their hopes of winning a decisive victory up north.
Our sources, they do a good job of describing those 3 days of fighting, the horrific losses, just the sheer bravery and desperation on both sides.
It was a bloodbath. Over 50,000 men killed, wounded, or captured.
Just awful. And a few months after Gettysburg, Lincoln gives that famous address.
Short speech, but wow, powerful stuff. In just a few minutes, he redefined the whole meaning of the war, the very purpose of the nation.
A new birth of freedom.
Exactly. And that line, government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth.
Powerful words. And after Gettysburg, the tide really does start to turn against the Confederacy, doesn't it?
It does. The war becomes a war of attrition. Grant's relentless campaigns in the East, Sherman's march through Georgia, that blockade tightening its grip, the South was being squeezed.
But they fought on.
They did. Driven by, I don't know, maybe desperation, a fierce belief in their independence, the idea that they were defending everything they held dear.
But they were up against it.
They were. And in the end, they couldn't withstand the might of the Union.
April 1865. Lee surrenders to Grant. Appomattox Courthouse. It's over.
A moment of, I think, relief, but also tremendous sadness.
The fighting was finally over, but the cost was immense.
Over 620,000 Americans dead. The nation survived, but the scars of that war, man, they would take generations to heal.
But out of the wreckage, there was this sense of hope. Maybe a chance for a new beginning.
Slavery was finally abolished, and the nation could start the long, hard process of putting itself back together.
Reconstruction.
Yeah. But as our sources point out, Reconstruction, well, it wasn't going to be easy,
Mm.
and there was no clear path forward.
Yeah, Reconstruction, this huge effort to put the pieces back together. But our sources, they make it seem like there was no clear plan for how to even do that.
Right. There were so many questions, like how do you even begin to reunify a nation after something like this?
And what should that nation even look like?
Exactly. Some wanted to punish the South. Others, they were more about forgiveness, reconciliation.
And then you had the massive issue of, well, what about the formerly enslaved people?
Millions of people suddenly free. But no real plan for how they fit in economically, socially. It's hard to grasp the scale of it.
It really is.
Such a unique situation. Immense challenges, but also incredible opportunities. You know,
Yeah.
a real chance to build something more just, more equitable. But there was resistance at every turn.
And we see that in the government's policies, right? The Freedmen's Bureau, the 14th and 15th Amendments. Were those steps in the right direction?
Oh, they were big developments for sure. The Freedmen's Bureau, it started in '65, provided some basic stuff, food, clothing, and really importantly, it helped set up schools for formerly enslaved people.
Education.
Yeah, seen as essential to empowering these communities.
It sounds like it was a lifeline for so many.
It was. And the 14th and 15th Amendments, those were huge steps towards equality, at least in theory.
Yeah, on paper, they seemed like monumental victories.
They were. The 14th, ratified in '68, it granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to everyone born in the U.S., which, completely overturned that Dred Scott decision that had denied citizenship to black people.
Right, right.
And then the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, gave black men the right to vote.
It's amazing how much changed in such a short time. But if these were such big wins, why do our sources talk about Reconstruction as a failure? What went wrong?
Well, the reality on the ground was a lot different than those laws on paper.
Yeah.
I mean, there were people, organizations working so hard to make these reforms a reality to help black communities. But man, they faced huge obstacles.
Like the rise of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah,
basically.
exactly. Violence, intimidation was rampant. And then you had all these efforts to restrict black people's access to land, to jobs, poll taxes, literacy tests, all designed to stop them from voting.
It's awful to see those hopes for a just society being crushed like that. Why do you think the North's commitment to Reconstruction faded?
I think it was a lot of things. The North had its own problems,
Yeah.
economic troubles, war fatigue. People wanted to move on.
Put it all behind them.
And politically, there was this growing feeling that maybe the South had suffered enough. Let them handle their own affairs.
So a mix of fatigue, changing priorities, and maybe some political convenience.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And sadly, the South took advantage of that. They were determined to bring back white supremacy, and they used everything they could, violence, intimidation, legal loopholes, to undermine Reconstruction.
And it all culminated in the Compromise of 1877.
Yeah. Basically, a presidential election was traded for pulling federal troops out of the South.
That's wild.
It was controversial, and it left black people in the South incredibly vulnerable. I mean, no federal troops to protect them. They were at the mercy of the very people who had fought to keep them oppressed.
What a tragic end to what started with so much promise. And the legacy of this failure, I mean, we're still dealing with it today, aren't we?
We are. Racial inequality, economic disparities, voter suppression. These issues have deep roots in this period. It shows that the fight for justice, for equality, it's never really over.
Wow, what a deep dive this has been. From those early tensions to the war to the broken promises of Reconstruction, it's been heavy but also so insightful.
It's complex, challenging history, for sure. but it's vital to understand it. And to remember, it's not just about dates and battles, it's about people. Stories of resilience, courage, sacrifice, and the hope for something better.
It really makes you think, could things have been different? Were there chances to avoid the war, to create a more just peace, to truly live up to those ideals of equality?
Tough questions. Ones that historians, and all of us really, are still trying to answer. And by looking at the past, we gain insights that can help us deal with the challenges we face today. The fight for justice, for equality, it's a relay race across generations. And knowing the past helps us run our leg of the race better.
Powerful stuff. So, as we wrap up, what's the key takeaway here? What should our listener be thinking about as they go about their day?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is this. History isn't just facts and figures. It's a living story, one that still shapes our world. And it's a story we all have a responsibility to engage with, to learn from, to let it guide our choices.
That's a great point. The Civil War, Reconstruction, they may be over, but their echoes are still here, reminding us that the fight for a better, more just society, it's never truly finished. It's on us to carry that torch forward. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey through such a crucial part of American history.